Sok szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit, hogyha esetleg Ivána azt hitte, hogy ő neki a legrosszabb, hogy a coffee break előtt kellett.
Because she had to present before the coffee break, well, she was wrong, because it's actually much worse, well, somewhat worse, to be the last presenter at the end of a 7-hour conference, and I'm going to remedy this problem by promising to keep it short, even though the technical issue made my time or my introduction a little bit longer. As a matter of fact, my presentation is built upon the topic that I was asked to present about. So I proceeded in the same sequence like my colleagues, but we are going to skip the theoretical slides. Please allow me to just give you a short look into Hungarian criminal legislation. I pressed the button and everything disappeared. As it was found from the outlook of other countries, well, at the time when the Soviet Union fell apart had a serious impact on these countries, including Hungary. It was at that time that criminal legislation was reformed in Hungary, just like in neighboring countries. And the way it was done in Hungary is that starting from 1987, the existing criminal and procedural acts and decrees were being patched up on a regular basis. They tried to depart a little bit from the Stalinian laws and get closer to modern European standards, and in some cases they succeeded, while in others they failed. But my observation is that it was the same in some other countries as well. So in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they tried to do something fast, and then some time had to lapse before it all came to fruition. So I really enjoyed listening to the other presentations to hear that in most other countries, it also took close to 2 decades for the currently effective laws to be formulated, roughly. And it was the same in Hungary. You can see that the Criminal Code was dated 1978, the procedural law came from 1973, and the law decree is dated 1979. What is interesting and what you can observe in Hungary is that the legal order couldn't be re-established for a long time. Well, you can see that the procedural law was actually dated earlier than the law decree. So you can see the dates here, and then in 1989 we had the procedural law, and then we had the act of substantial law, and now the sequence is in order, but for quite some time it was in reverse order, which resulted in a strange situation. I'll try and slow down and that way complete everything fast. You can see the main issues we were facing. So on the one hand, the 3 basic laws needed major revision. The Criminal Procedure Code predates the Criminal Code, as I mentioned before, and the third big issue was that the rules on the execution of sentences were not regulated in an act. So this is where we were in 1990 at the time of the regime change, and it's from this situation that we had to get to where we are now. And this is where we are now. We have an act of 2012 on the Criminal Code, a procedural act of 2017, and the enforcement law on the Penal Act from 2013. So now it's all in the right sequence. So first the Criminal Code came, and the enforcement rules were also enacted in law. I am not going to go into details of the basic principles. You can see that there are unique characteristics. If you are interested, you can read it in detail in the study, but the basic principles seem to be very similar from previous presentations. Well, they are similar between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Obviously, after the regime change, all former socialist countries try to get closer to European standards in this sense as well. The principle of legality, I think, is the same in all countries. The principle of responsibility and the principle of liability based on fault. Again, I'm not going into details laws because it had all been mentioned by previous presenters. The ultima ratio nature has some theoretical significance, but I don't think it's spelled out enough at the level of law. I am sure that we know that the ultima ratio nature of law must be achieved. For example, if Ronaldo kicks the ball and it goes above the goal and he's told off by his teammate, then there will be no legal consequences. So in some matters we don't need legal regulations. But if Cristiano Ronaldo gets bored with Manchester United and wants to transfer to AC Milan, then there is need for legal regulation because there is a contract under civil law that needs to be terminated. So even though we are in sports, there is room for law. So if a teammate finds out that he wants to transfer to Milan and then he's going to break his leg and tells everyone so, then criminal law kicks in. And it's pretty much the same at the level of legal regulation. So this ultima ratio nature must be enforced, not only in legal regulation, but also in the application of the law. Many say that when it comes to the ultima ratio, it's used to determine which sanctions to apply, but I think it's more complex than that, and I think the legal regulation of that is still outstanding to some extent. The next one is the principle of proportionality. You can also read about it. As for the nebis in idem principle, even the new Hungarian procedural law contains the European principle of nebis in idem. And of course, the issue is not the fact that if someone was actually sentenced for murder in the Netherlands, then they are not going to be again judged in Hungary. That's easy to establish. I am a solicitor, not just a university professor, and I had a drug-related crime among my cases where the person's house was searched in Hungary because there was a criminal procedure ongoing against the person in Austria. And during the search, they found the drugs. And after this, the person was sentenced for the possession of drugs in Hungary, while that was actually part of the procedures in Austria as well. So in Hungary, the ownership of drugs would have been part of the ownership or trading of drugs principle. It was otherwise in this situation, and although we referred to the nebis in idem principle, it's a much more complex issue at European level, and no one really understood what I wanted. I actually wrote a study on this, and it's worth reading, not just because I wrote it, but because it's an interesting matter. The next principle is in the in dubio pro reo principle, which again in the procedural law and not in substantial law, similarly to the previous principle. And just to reassure you, I'm not going to go into details of this either. And then the responsibility of criminal liability. And I often say in my university presentations that if something is not that important, they are in very small print on the PPT slide, so you can see that it's not that important. I actually just didn't know I would have so little time. It is important. The next slide is about the types of offense or crimes, criminal offenses. So there are these two types, felony and misdemeanor. So you can see there is preparation crime and completed crime, the different stages, and then the matter of obstacles to criminalization. And there are grounds excluding or limiting criminal liability, grounds for decriminalization, and other obstacles to criminal prosecution. Out of these, as much as I reviewed the presentations, they are pretty much similar in each of the countries. However, I would highlight
éppen a tevékeny megbánás alapján akkor szüntetik meg az
the issue of mediation, because the procedure is only terminated if there is a successful procedure completed. So there is a procedural obstacle under the substantive factors. And there is one category which is regulated in civil law, even though I believe it should be here. The set of sanctions, system of penalties. If you look at the previous criminal code and today's criminal code, you could say that the sanctions were totally transformed. Previously, we had main punishments and secondary punishments, and now we have main punishments and secondary punishments. So it's really basically the same system. We have punishments and so-called measurements, and within the different penalties, punishments, there are supplementary punishments, actually just one. And it would appear that it's a very well organized system of sanctions with many different sanctions involved. I participated in a conference 10 plus years ago, the specific objective of which was to transform the sanction system and introduce new sanctions. And we only managed to introduce one, which was the partially suspended custodial sentence. They didn't introduce anything else, even though they could suspend a ban on driving or a ban on exercising a certain profession. And just to quote again one of my cases, there is a customer where the custodial sentence cannot be executed because he has no tolerance of prison circumstances, because the prison cannot offer the treatment he needs. So there is no alternative in Hungary. They keep referring, taking him into prison. They are waiting for him to either die or come up with a kind of execution methodology that would allow him to do something. But if we had home custody as a sanction, like in the US, this issue could be resolved. And just to show you one or two pictures, well, there is no scientific presentation without charts. These are figures, and they are incomprehensible because obviously I don't want to go into them in detail. It's the trends that matter. If you look at the number of crimes in Hungary per 100,000 of population, you can see a significant decline in the past 20 years. And as to what the reasons are, you should all listen to the presentation of Clara Keresi, who will also go into the potential reasons. There can be underlying reasons like a general decline in international crime. Obviously, according to the government, it's also down to the positive measures taken by the government. There can be also administrative reasons. So when the limit of petty crime was raised, then suddenly a lot of criminal offenses that qualified as crime were only now violations of regulations, so there can be such reasons as well. But the figures show a significant decline indeed, both in terms of the number of crimes and the number of perpetrators over the past 20 years. And that is also interesting, the number of thefts, because I don't know how it works in other countries, but in Hungary, a significant part of criminal offenses are against property. So the trend in crime against property has a significant impact on the total number of crimes. And that's why when they increase the value of the limit, then obviously a smaller proportion of the crimes fall into this category. But you can also see that the number of homicides are also reduced, which cannot be blamed on reducing the value limits. So there are indeed real achievements and interesting issues. So it's a great potential for criminal research. You can see the number of sexual assaults in Hungary as well. It's a strange chart because actually the most recent figure is at the top, so we see some progress. And then traffic offenses. It's interesting that in Hungary 77% of transport crimes or traffic crimes is drink driving. So before you think it's my scientific area, well, no, these are the charts of others. Again, on the next chart, you can see a drop in offenses against the orderly management of businesses. When it comes to corruption offenses, there are some outstanding years, and it's not that low now, even though some people think otherwise. And there are crimes against children and family. In the study, I explain the proportions in detail and what they are roughly down to. It's very encouraging for everyone that I am now approaching the conclusions, the summary, which means that I'm going to stop my presentation very soon. So first, I'd like to mention something very important.
Főforrásaink a 70-es évekből származtak, és ezek
So the original concept came from the 1970s, and they had to be reworked significantly. And first they kept modifying and amending them and adding to them. And in the past decade, the acts that are in force today emerged, which are again being amended. And if we just consider the fact that how the criminal code and the procedural law relates to the previous versions, then I would say, and some people might dispute it, that the change is less in the criminal code than in the procedural law. I actually couldn't make it to the morning part of the conference because at 8:30 I still had a meeting in Szexárd, which is 140 kilometers south of Budapest, and there were two accused at the trial. It was actually a pre-trial section, to be very precise, and one of the accused didn't turn up, the other did. And then previously we would have set a next date, etc., and we would have delayed the trial. But in today's system, the way it works is that at the preparatory meeting, the customer actually agreed to the fact that they committed the crime, actually approved the prosecutor's proposal for the range of punishment. That took 5 minutes, and then for 25 minutes we had to wait for technical issues to be resolved, like here, because the computer that was in the room wouldn't work, etc., So for 25 minutes we were waiting for the judge to go to another room so that they can print the judgment. But otherwise, I must say that it was net 7 minutes plus, gross 33 minutes, which was a 1-year custodial sentence suspended for 2 years, and the prosecutor acknowledged it, and the criminal process came to an end. And if I checked out, and I'm not going to because I am not interested, but for the other accused, there will be no judgment in the court of first sentence even in 2023. So this new practice, whereby if the accused agrees to the crime committed in the first hearing and they waive the right to appeal, because of course the judge can impose a lower sentence but not a higher sentence. So if they acknowledge this process and agree to it, then it means a significant change to the previous procedure. As a practicing lawyer, I must say that 6 out of 10 cases have pretty much the same outcome. I don't know what the national proportions are, but this new option totally changed the structure of punitive processes. And in cases where we all know what the outcome would be, we can come to a conclusion much faster. I could also highlight that the criminal code also included criminal execution type provisions, but now it's all transposed into the procedural law. And as a matter of fact, we can conclude, we can notice from the data that the number of registered crimes declined significantly, but as to what the reason is, we'll get an answer from Clara tomorrow. At least we will hear something. You will get your favorite slide from me, for which you were here this morning as well. So thank you for the attention, and if you have any questions, I am happy to answer them. Thank you.